Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Absher. I'm the director of the Tillamook County Department of Community Development. And with us this evening to discuss statewide planning goal and comprehensive plan goal elements 3 and 4, which are our agricultural and forest land goals, are Hilary Foote. She is the Farm Forest Land Specialist with the Department of Land Conservation and Development for the state of Oregon. My guess is she probably looks quite familiar to many of you because she was a really critical member of our planning staff team here in Tillamook for a few years, and we miss you. We hope you're doing well, Hilary. So thank you for joining us this evening. Also with us is Jim Johnson. He's the Land Use and Water Planning Coordinator for the Oregon Department of Agriculture. We've had a great planning relationship with Jim for several years. He's been a wonderful resource to Tillamook County, and most notably, he was instrumental in the development of the conditional use planning process for Senate Bill 1517 that talks about wetland restoration projects on property zone exclusive farm use. And then lastly, we have Chuck Weiler, who is the Executive Director of the Coast Range Association here with us this evening. And all three of our panelists are going to be visiting with us about the relationship of these important goals, how these activities play into and what their relationship is with our community. And I think you'll be surprised to learn more about the important role that they actually serve, whether it's by providing buffers, flood storage, or other ways that these important lands help shape, define, and enhance your community. So Hilary, let's go ahead and start with you. So thanks again for joining us this evening. I love that you're going to have a very unique perspective because you have been intimately involved in planning efforts for the community of Neskowin, as well as you were our farm and forest planner for Tillamook County. So I would love to ask you first, what do you think Neskowin citizens need to know about goals 3 and 4?
And thank you for having me here tonight. It's so fun to be talking to a Tillamook audience again. So, as Sarah said, I worked for Tillamook County for a number of years before joining the Department of Land Conservation and Development as the Farm and Forest Specialist for the state. So, what do you need to know about statewide planning goals 3 and 4? So I understand that this is the last in a long series talking about the goals that the state of Oregon has set for itself that address public process, the preservation and use of natural resource lands, efficient urban development, and our unique coastal landscape. So I'll just talk really briefly at a very high summary level about goals 3 and 4. All right. So both of these goals recognize that Oregon has unique and limited natural resources, arable lands and timberlands. And they recognize that these resources form the base of a significant portion of our state's economy. Both of these goals speak to protecting these resources as working lands and as economic assets, while also acknowledging that the preservation of working lands intersects with other important values like open space, recreation, habitat, ecosystem services, and a lot of other natural resources. So a little bit about how goals 3 and 4 are implemented. So and what they look like in your county, in your neck of the woods. So during the late 70s and the early 80s, when counties were implementing land use planning program, they were required to inventory all of their lands outside of urban growth boundaries, their rural lands. And those lands were put into 3 general buckets, okay? Agricultural lands, forest lands, and then what are called exception lands. Exception lands are those areas that had already been developed or were surrounded by development to the extent that they really couldn't be practically used for farm operations or forest practices. And then those exception lands were generally designated for residential use, commercial use, or industrial use. So all of the land that's within the unincorporated community of Nescowen fall into that last bucket, their exception lands. So goals 3 and 4 do not apply within the community boundary of Nescowen because exceptions to those goals have already been taken. The majority of lands surrounding Nescowen, however, are designated as forest or mixed farm forest lands. And there's also a large agricultural area up to the north of Nescowen near Ortown. So when the counties were going through these exercises to identify lands and put them into those buckets, agricultural lands were primarily identified based on NRCS soil capability classification. So this is one of the unique aspects of Oregon's farm program, that it is sound science-based as far as how those lands were identified. And our program also allows counties to consider other factors to account for local flexibility and variations in farm practices. For example, land that might be needed for manure spreading and dairy operations. For forest land, state rules didn't offer as clear of a definition. And the forest inventories were far more individualized county to county. But essentially at the end of the day, once counties had gone through and inventoried their lands as exception lands, farmlands, or forest lands, those inventories were adopted into your county comprehensive plan and acknowledged by the state. Yeah. So farmlands subject to statewide planning goal 3 and forest lands subject to statewide planning goal 4 are then protected under restrictive zoning ordinances. So unlike a lot of other goals that you talked about, state statute that implements the goals and our agency rules that clarify those goals are very prescriptive when it comes to the kind of development that can occur on lands that are protected as farm and forest lands. And they are very restrictive in how those lands can be divided. So for both farm and forest, there are lists of uses that are allowed outright, lists of uses that are subject to land use review and require public notice. And that's done at the state level. In Tillamook County, your ordinances very closely mirror what's in state statute and in rule for farm and forest zones. And I would just end on a note that over the past 48 years, this program has been very successful in slowing the conversion of these really important resource lands, especially when you compare Oregon to other states in the United States. Since 1987, since really the implementation of the program, we've managed to maintain 99.8% of land that was originally designated as agricultural lands and protected under exclusive farm use zoning, which is a pretty good metric. And I think I'll leave it at that since I think I've exceeded my 10 minutes, but I'm certainly happy to address any additional questions.
Thank you, Hilary. Well, we will certainly come back to you because I am sure we're going to have some additional questions for you. Mr. Johnson, so for you, how do you think we are positioned to better understand the value of agricultural and forest lands relative to development when they seem to be diminishing or consolidating over time? And I understand that your area of expertise is primarily agricultural lands, but so could you speak to that from your perspective?
Well, sure. Number one, it's my focus area. I actually had Hilary's position about 3 positions ago when I was at DLCD about, oh gosh, now 25 28 years ago, I don't know. And I was a county planner before that. So I think it's great that you brought up the economics of agriculture, because really a lot of people that don't understand the Oregon Planning Program immediately talk about, oh, we're protecting agriculture and forest land for open space values, and that's not the primary purpose of why we protect agricultural land, or for that matter forest land in Oregon. And before I get into some numbers for you, and anybody that's heard me talk before knows I'm great at throwing a lot of statistics out, but they are important. I think it's important that that people that are working with farmland protection, agricultural land protection, need to understand that when Senate Bill 100 was passed that established the Oregon Planning Program, there was a companion bill that a lot of people don't know about. That was Senate Bill 101. And Senate Bill 101 establishes the legislative policy for protecting agricultural land in Oregon. And I'm not going to read through the whole policy, but I would suggest to you, I'll recommend to you all that you go to ORS 215-243. That's where that legislative policy is actually listed, and you can read it. And it really talks about all the elements that Hilary kind of got into from a legislative policy standpoint. And one of those elements is the economic importance of agriculture. Agriculture accounts for about 12 to 15% of the state's gross national product. It accounts for 1 in every 20 jobs in Oregon. Oregon agriculture is an export-related business. 80% of its value leaves the state, 40% of that leaves the country. And why that's important is that makes it a traded sector aspect of the economy. It's bringing new money into Oregon. It's not just recirculating money within the state. Those are all key things in any kind of economic analysis. I think when you look at Tillamook County, and a lot of people say, oh, gee, Tillamook County is a very small agricultural state, or agricultural county in the state. If you just compare, apples to apples, maybe, but you've got to also take into account that Tillamook County only about, I'm looking at my numbers here now, only about 4.7% of the land area in Tillamook County is zoned for agricultural use. Yet, Tillamook County agricultural land on an acre by acre basis generates $400 more an acre in economic value than the state average. It generates about $3,800 plus per acre, and that accounts for all land, all farmland. So that could be a small hobby farm all the way up to the largest dairy that you have in Tillamook County. So agriculture is very, very important to Tillamook County. It has a very small land base in the larger scheme of things in Tillamook County. And so, and in my opinion, it probably grows the best grass in the entire state of Oregon. And because of that, it is what I would call a high value production county in the state in terms of the type of agriculture it has. There's 109 confined animal feeding operations registered with the State Department of Agriculture just in Tillamook County alone. Tillamook County is second only to Morrow County in the value of milk production. And the only reason Morrow County is bigger is you've got these huge dairies over there where you're talking about thousands and thousands of animals within one farm. Whereas Tillamook County is really much more a family farm oriented dairy county. So economics is key. The state planning goals recognize that. And recognize that economic value is enough reason by itself to protect agricultural land. Of course, in the materials that were provided by Brenda prior to the meeting, it talks about all the other reasons to protect agricultural land, from open space and wildlife and the like, and those are all very valid reasons. But when push comes to shove, it is an important element of Tillamook County's economy, and a very, very important element to the state of Oregon's economy. We're basically second only to electronics in terms of a lot of the economic factors in the state. I really wanted to add on real quickly to one thing that Hilary talked about in terms of the goals. When you're talking about protecting agricultural land in Oregon, and we kind of reference this up front about all the goals being important, I really focus on 3 goals though when I'm talking about agricultural land protection. Goal 3, of course, which is the agricultural lands goal, but also goal 11, which deals with the provision of public services, whether they're rural or urban, inside and outside urban growth boundaries. So sewer, water, and the like, and not extending them outside of urban settings and such. So it's very, very important to not promoting urbanization on rural lands. And then, of course, goal 14, which is, creates the urban growth boundary requirements in the state of Oregon. And one of the reasons I believe that Oregon's planning program is so successful is how the goals work together. Without good rural planning, there's going to be sprawl out on the rural lands, and there's not going to be an encouragement to have efficient and effective planning or development with inside urban growth boundaries. Without good planning inside the urban growth boundary, there's going to be a greater pressure to expand that urban growth boundary and convert more farm and forest land. So those goals all work together. You have to have good urban planning. You have to have good rural planning to have a successful farm preservation program, in my experience. And so I'll stop right there, Sarah, and add on to anything else somebody might have later on. So.
Great, thank you very much, Jim. We appreciate it. So moving on to Chuck. So Chuck, welcome. Let's see, I do not
see here.
Is Chuck? See, I thought I saw him.
I don't see him here.
Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and keep going. I'm going to go ahead and then bounce back to Hilary. So we've got some great questions here that I would like to keep discussing, if that's okay, Randall and Brenda and Chris.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So Hilary, let's start with you. I think this would be a great question for both you and Jim. What can Nescoin do to protect its buffering land and watershed?
What can it do to protect its buffering land and watershed?
Yeah, so I think what we're talking about is, you and Jim have done a great job of talking about how important these resource lands are, not only to our communities, but to the state of Oregon, right? There's a lot of environmental and economic importance to these lands. And so if Nescoin wanted to do their part to help protect these lands, and I would add to that probably the transitional lands, because Nescoin does have those areas where, there are properties that abut forest zones, but then there's also properties that are zoned rural residential or Nescoin RR, others that kind of lead into these important resource lands. What do you think that they could do to protect those lands, but then also the watersheds? That's a big deal in Nescoin, and that's a very important community.
So I think ultimately, I would point back to the primary purpose of goals 3 and 4, which is protecting those resource lands and limiting development within them. So when you're looking at the forested landscapes that surround Nescoin, that are zoned primarily for forest uses and for mixed farm forest use, conserving those lands by protecting them under that sort of restrictive zoning also has ecosystem value, right? So by avoiding conversion to more intensive development like rural residential, you are also preserving those lands for their ecosystem value that contribute to water quality protection, and that also conserve them for sequestration values as well, which is a emerging topic around particularly the coastal rainforests. That said, it's also really important, and I want to stress that the land use program does not regulate forest practices or farm practices. Local governments are actually statutorily prohibited from regulating forest practices themselves. So when you're talking about like timber harvests or aerial spraying, those are forest practices that are governed under the Forest Practices Act, which is within the purview of the Department of Forestry and the Board of Forestry. So it is actually Department of Forestry's rules that set buffers and noticing requirements around those types of issues. So again, if there are opportunities to participate with Department of Forestry on those topics, I believe they actually have their Northwest Regional Forest Practices Committee is meeting this week, and those meetings are open to the public. If that is something that folks are interested in. But those sorts of things are not regulated through the land use program. So by maintaining forest lands and farmlands under that protective forest zoning, by limiting the types of uses that are developed within those areas, that also naturally protects them for ecosystems values and other resource values.
Thank you. Jim, any thoughts on what the community can do?
Sure.
From your
First,
perspective?
first to jump on what Hilary said, I think it's really important to recognize the role that working lands do play in maintaining large blocks of land at really when in relationship to residential and commercial and industrial, for example, at low intensity type uses, which are nothing but beneficial to a lot of the watershed environments and the like, compared to other land uses. I mean, I'll be the first to admit that agriculture isn't perfect in terms of some of its practices, and we're constantly working to try to get better at that. ODA does regulate agriculture for water quality purposes through its water quality program and through its CAFO program, its confined animal feeding operation program. And so if there are water quality concerns related to agriculture, we want to know about it. And we do have a regulatory element of that. So we do want to get involved in that. So that is one thing that I would, let the citizens of your area know, is that there are avenues to talk to us about it at ODA in terms of water quality related elements. Another thing that I think that local citizens can do to really to be involved in protecting some of those things is to understand that it's not just an individual impact of proposed developments on all the natural resources we're talking about, whether it's natural resources or farm working lands, other natural resources like fish and wildlife or wetlands or the like, but it's the cumulative impact. And so keeping involved in terms of, okay, it's just one non-farm dwelling, or it's just one template dwelling, or it's just one agritourism thing. Well, that individually they may not be problematic, but when they start to get cumulatively can start to impact things. You need to understand that and be involved in the planning process and bring that up. I think it's important to recognize, and I'll focus on the exclusive farm use zone, but the same thing is in the forest zone also, or whatever. There are many non-farm uses in the zone that are optional. They're not even the county can be more restrictive or even preclude those. And if an area wants to say, gee, we want to be more restrictive or the like, that's a policy call for Tillamook County, and that's something you should be discussing with your planning commission, your county commissioners, and your planning staff. I know of counties that are more restrictive on certain uses, and it's not whether they allow them at all or they have additional conditional use standards, for example. And I've been talking more and more, for example, with jurisdictions around the state about having tighter controls on commercial uses in conjunction with farm use. It's not a very well-defined standard, and so there's all kinds of analysis or all kinds of interpretations going on around the state. And so those are the kind of things that citizens can get involved in. And in fact, where this is a hot topic in Central Oregon, for example, I've been advising them an awful lot on my opinions on definitions, for example, and definitions are really, really key. The other thing for buffers and the like, and I think it's interesting that issue of buffers comes up. I know that in goal 3, it talks about there should be buffers, and that's key, is should, between urban development and rural. It hasn't occurred yet within the statewide planning program. One of the things that I've always talked about with urban growth boundary proposals, for example, is that the proposed urban area needs to be providing some buffers on their edges, not on the ag land, but on the urban side of the line, where it's appropriate to keep non-compatible uses away from each other and to keep farm and forest practices viable. there's two types of conversion. One is just the outright footprint. You lose the land to an urban or a non-farm development. But the other is the shadow that that development casts on the surrounding farming operations and the like, and affects their ability to operate. So those buffers are really, really important. One of the things that local folks can do to protect natural resource lands and the like is get involved with organizations like the Tillamook Soil and Water Conservation District, the Oregon Ag Heritage Program, local land trusts, or for that matter, there are land trusts that actually operate larger than just local. They could be regional or statewide. And in a lot of cases, there are situations where you can look at easement type programs also to put easements on land that'll also help to really focus on what type of resources you're really trying to protect there and which ones you're trying to preclude. So those are some of the ways you could go.
Thank you, Jim. And, just to add some context to that part of the conversation, so Nescoan currently has that urban buffer that Jim is speaking to, and it's something that's been part of your community residential zoning code for decades, to be honest.
Great.
And what it is it's 100-foot setback. Now, recognizing that Nescoan has several lots of record that abut these resource lands, where that 100-foot setback is required for dwelling, and the lots themselves are not wide enough or deep enough as they were platted to even meet that 100 feet. There's a special land use review process called an exception, and you guys see those noticed every once in a while for comment, to where a landowner on a lot of record can get closer to 100 feet to a resource zone for a dwelling. But we have to do that impact assessment that Jim is talking about to look at protecting the resource use, and making sure that we're mitigating non-compatible uses between urban development and resource activities. Well, yes, Jim, please.
Well, and Sarah, that I didn't know that you guys do that. That's great. And there are examples around too about mitigating for those types of things. With, if you can't meet a setback, doing things like all kinds of berms and landscaping and the like. I know Jackson County has some requirements for doing certain kinds of landscape buffers and like between orchards and development and like. The Columbia River Gorge Commission has a section in their plan about requirements and the like. So I think that's great you guys do that, and that you could develop even more on that by actually talking about the types of mitigation measures that could be used to really mitigate for those exceptions.
And when you're talking about buffering from forest zones as well, a big concern there is
just going to go there. Thank you. Please. I was going to ask the question. This is great. It's just like old times. Please talk about wildfire risk and protection. Thank you.
Right. And so as Jim was mentioning, some of the mitigating measures for protecting agricultural land from residential development might include things like hedgerows or berms. When you're talking about forest zones, you're talking, and in this context where we're talking about protecting forestry uses from residential development, wildfire is one of the biggest concerns there. So there you'd be looking at mitigating measures that would look like defensive space standards, and maintaining fire breaks, maybe going above and beyond what's required in building code for standards. So for example, all dwellings in the forest zone have to have fire retardant roofs, spark arresters, and chimneys. They have to have adequate water supply for fire suppression. So if you're talking about, developing around the edge of Nescoan, sort of abutting up against those forested areas, this becomes really big because most wildfires are human caused. And when you have scattered residential development in these forested area with heavy fuel loads, the risk of fire increases, and the potential cost of fire suppression also increases. There's some really interesting studies out there around how the cost of suppression increases exponentially the farther away the houses are from each other. And when you're managing fires and protecting structures that are more isolated, the practices change too when you're approaching that. So that's another thing. And I would also mention, that is actually in the unincorporated community rules that address planning and zoning for unincorporated communities like Neskowin, that county plans and land use regulations ensure that new and expanded uses within the unincorporated communities do not adversely affect agricultural or forestry uses in adjacent surrounding areas. And so I think one of the tools that Neskowin used in the past were those buffers.
Hilary, just for our audience, could you explain what a fuel load is, especially in terms of development in communities? So what would be a fuel load when we're talking about increased risk to forest lands?
No, when you're talking about wildland fires, you're primarily talking about vegetative fuel loads. And so so that can be your trees, grasses, forbs, shrubs, include a wide variety of materials. Of course, when you're talking about an urban environment, that can include anything that's like a structure or combustible. One of the concerns about residential uses is there tends to be a lot of more combustible things, like, do you have a gas can in your garage, for example? Do you have a propane tank at the side of your house? So when you're thinking about residential development up against these forested areas with a lot of vegetative fuel, it's really important to think about how to protect that vegetation from the additional risk posed by those residential uses.
Right. And for some of us, the risk could be the oven in the kitchen too.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. On that note, maybe I would plug, hopefully this isn't too distracting, but there was a bill that was passed this last session, the Wildfire Bill, Senate Bill 762, that has impacted a number of agencies, including DLCD. And where it will impact land use is that ODF is engaged in a process right now to update statewide wildfire risk maps. And there's an ongoing rulemaking at the Department of Forestry currently on that. So we are expecting these new wildfire risk maps that categorize risk into 5 different buckets over the state to be coming shortly. So starting early next year, DLCD is going to be engaging in a process to identify updates to the statewide land use planning program and local comprehensive plans and zoning codes, right, like Tillamook counties. So what are the updates that are needed in order to incorporate these new wildfire risk maps? And I'm sure that will include a lot of discussion around defensible space, building codes, evacuation, and other development considerations in those areas of high wildfire risk. So that's a bit of a plug that this process will be coming up, and we anticipate that will begin early next year. We actually have a planning position open right now. It's published for a wildfire planner that will be managing a lot of that work for us. So stay tuned on that front.
Thank you, Hilary. And I think, again, just to stress, I mean, from our perspective, working in the office and in the department, that resource zone setback, that buffer, is a surprise to a lot of people who visit our office or call us, especially for properties that are for sale, that are along the outer fringes within the community itself, or those rural residential zone or SFW 10 zone properties that are outside of the community boundary, but still fall within the boundary of the CAC. And folks don't typically realize that that 100-foot setback is actually to protect the resource use that's occurring on the adjacent property, and to minimize conflicting uses. And so when you're looking at your community plan and updates, one of the conversations that we have often is, how do we change or get rid of that resource zone setback? And that has come up often and regularly in conversations with folks that either already own property in Muskogee or are looking to purchase property in Muskogee. And I think that as the community talks about their zoning and what they would like to see, and if the community is interested in exploring ways to mitigate those incompatible uses or impacts, especially with what Hilary's talking about with respect to wildfire risk reduction and mitigation, that might be something that the community wants to take a closer look at and decide if that 100-foot setback is appropriate, if that's something that the community would like to see modified, or if it's something where there could be some, especially for properties abutting forest zones, those wildfire protection requirements that Hilary was talking to in relation to buffers where you have cleared vegetation, maybe fire resistant materials, spark arresters for chimneys, those types of standards that we already fold into looking at siting a dwelling in a forest zone, which can happen on an extremely limited basis. But there are some things that the community could consider if they are interested in reducing risk and increasing resiliency to the overall community. So Jim, do you have any comments on that as far as especially the wildfire risk or some of what you're seeing come out of the state legislature for future planning?
I remember my days back at DLCD when we would be talking about forest, and I think number one, I'm really impressed that you guys have what you have. I remember there were some counties that were way ahead of everybody else years ago. I mean, Deschutes County, for example, I don't know if they still do this, would not allow dwellings in the forest zone if they weren't located within a fire district, for example. So you'd have to incorporate a new fire district or the like. And those are all things that are not mandated by, or weren't mandated by state law. Some things will change probably, but that the county was thinking ahead and worried about those types of things. I would make this suggestion to you about making changes to buffers and the like. A lot of people forget that when you take an exception to goals 3 and 4, you're not only determining that the lands within the exception area are irrevocably built and committed such that they're not really available for farm or forest use, but the second step to that exceptions process is, regardless of the forest or farm viability, will the proposed development that will then be located within those exception areas adversely impact farm or forest practices? And if the answer is that they will adversely impact farm or forest practices, then the exception area is usually not approved. A lot of times those things can be mitigated. And if your exception, for example, was based on having these setbacks so that they wouldn't adversely impact the surrounding resource lands, and then you remove that setback, you might be affecting the original exception, and you may have to take a new exception. I don't know if that's for sure, because I don't know what the exception was based on in Tillamook County, but I have seen situations before where proposals to, oh, we already have an exception area, so we can just do some different things in there. Exceptions were based on the findings that were made at the time of the exception. So you have to go back and look at what those were. And if you're going to change that, what can occur within the exception area, you may have to redo the exception from the start. So that's something to consider. Having said that, it sounds to me like you guys, are out in front of a lot of other places, and you don't have to go that far back in history to remember some of the, you don't hear about the wildfires so much on the west side of the Cascades until last year, but don't forget the Tillamook burns. So I hate to say this, but we may be due for another one. And so I think it's great that you guys are thinking about these things as an ex-forest land planner. It's just, it's such an important part to the integrity of what Tillamook County is.
Thank you, Jim. So one of the things that the community is hoping to do, the CAC, is put together a survey. So especially as we start wrapping up these town hall meetings, which have been phenomenal across the board, I have to say. I mean, there's a lot I've learned in, you know, helping to facilitate these. And I would encourage, especially, you know, Hilary at DLCD, if anybody wanted to watch, I think they're all recorded. And, you know, there's been some great conversations about our comp plan and statewide planning goals. But as the CAC moves forward with a survey in relation to goals 3 and 4 and the importance of resource lands and their activities, which are pretty wide, right? It can be anything from a commercial dairy, it can be forest resource, you know, timber activities, it can be a quarry, right? So there's a lot of things we don't think about that maybe actually could get pretty close to our communities. And their desire to protect their watershed. What kind of questions would you recommend that the CAC consider for that community survey?
You know, it would be kind of interesting from my perspective, and it might help to, you know, education is just as important as regulation in terms of what we do. It would be kind of interesting to ask some questions to see if how much people understand the role that farm and forestry operations play in Tillamook County. I mean, when I look at Oregon's top crops, for example, 3 of the top 5 are key to Oregon's economy, and they all occur in Tillamook County, and that's cattle and calves number 2, hay number 3, and milk number 4. And when you put those 3 together, because they're all related, they, in my opinion, they become the number 1 ag commodity in the state, even passing the nursery industry. So I think that it would be interesting that to somehow ask some questions that get at do you understand the value of agriculture, to Tillamook County, the value of and it's not just the value of the economic aspects of the agriculture. Let's face it, what does people think of when you say Tillamook? It's cheese, and so it's as much a tourist thing as it is an agricultural element in terms of economy. So questions to ask, my gosh, one of the things I haven't talked about is aquaculture, and I'd just be curious what people's impressions are about what would happen if there was more aquaculture activities in some of Tillamook's estuaries. And I'm not going to say I'm promoting them one way or the other, but Tillamook County is the leading aquaculture state in the state, or county in the state of Oregon. When you combine all the shellfish operations and the fishing operations, it's bigger than any of the other counties, believe it or not. And a lot of people forget about those shellfish operations. So gosh, but as it relates to Nesco, and I think it all comes back to the role that working lands play in providing a landscape that the citizens of the Nescoan area really value. And so it's somehow to focus on that, the buffers, the fact that are there elements of farmer forest land that concern them that maybe need to be reevaluated? Are there is there a role that easements can play to provide to help to provide some of those buffers, not only on the rural residential or the community, but on the farm and forest lands? Farmers are more and more actively thinking about the use of easements to not only protect farmland from conversion, from development or whatever, but to also to help them to manage their natural resource issues like water quality, like wetland development and the like. I mean, it sounds great to establish a wetland, but what does that wetland do to the surrounding lands in terms of the farming operations, for example? So I'm kind of rambling here, but that's, I've been thinking about this for at least a week, since Brenda sent out some of these things. And, how does protection of resource land work with a rural unincorporated community. And so it really comes down to that edge more and more. And then the greater landscape, which I would call, for the lack of a term, the watershed that it's within, and how that watershed is implicated, is going to be implicated by both the non-farm development and the for the lack of a term, the urban development within the rural unincorporated community and the rural development. That's all part of the watershed. So.
Appreciate that. Hilary, what do you think?
So I think we're always interested in understanding what people's experiences engaging the land use planning system have been, and where we can support, we being DLCD, can support improved opportunities for engagement. So as far as like feedback, I'd be curious to know, what folks' experience in Nescoin have been with the statewide planning system, what their experience with goals 3 and with goals 4 have been, or with the land use planning system in general. So one, that would be first part there. Secondly, I think since it is a hot topic, again, on the wildfire, I'd be curious to get feedback from the community, what their thoughts are on that topic, how they feel like they could better prepare the community to be resilient in the face of those kind of hazardous events. How can you look at house hardening and other indefensible space to prepare and prevent those kind of minimize the risk of wildfire within the community, especially since it is in such a heavily forested area there. So I think that would be an interesting topic to get feedback on from the community as well. And then I'd be curious to also understand how people within the community of Nescoin value their working lands. How do they see the role that those resources provide to their community as well, because it's important to understand the different aspects of what is valued. Jim has done a great job highlighting the economic value of these resources, and the state explicitly in goals 3 and 4 recognizes resource lands as economic assets and is explicitly preserving them for their contribution to the economy, right? And they also provide other values for recreation, open space, and natural resources as well. So I'd be curious in your community how people understand and see that contribution for the community itself.
Thank you, Hilary.
Yeah.
We do not have any questions in the chat, so if anyone has a question, please go ahead and ask in the chat. I have a question while we're waiting to see if anybody else wants to type anything in. So again, having the opportunity to have Hilary join us this evening and her unique perspective, and also being intimately involved in the planning program for Tillamook County and the community of Nescoin. So Hilary, as you know, Nescoin a few years ago went through a huge effort to look at coastal erosion, community resiliency, develop the Nescoin Coastal Hazards Adaptation Plan.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many coastal communities like Nescoin that are looking at strategies for resiliency, which may include relocation in the future. And in development of that planning effort and strategies, the only place to go is in the farm or forest zone, which primarily in Nescoin could be, and most likely will be, areas that are currently zoned forest. And so looking ahead, I guess my question would be twofold. The first one is, what do you know other coastal communities that are like Nescoin, where they are surrounded by resource lands? Have you been involved in any conversations with those communities about the relocation discussion and planning for the future? And then the second would be, in that instance, what, as the community continues to have these discussions and explore ways to increase resiliency, thinking about the forest zone, what kind of recommendations or, food for thought would you offer?
So this is a really tough question all up and down the coast. In hazards mitigation planning, you're looking at addressing some really difficult questions. And as the current rules are written, Neskowin would not be able to expand their community boundary because of their proximity to Lincoln City. And so the opportunity to actually expand the unincorporated urban community boundary isn't available. And it is a tension that gets back to the foundational aspects of the planning program, which were to contain that dense urban development within, urban areas, right? And to protect resource lands for resource uses, with the intention really of planning for efficient development and also, minimizing costs of services. And so when you are looking at or contemplating, expanding development into resource areas, that is going to bring with it a whole other set of challenges, hazards, conflicts, and costs associated with potentially inefficient development in rural areas. So to talk, Jim mentioned earlier, goals 14 and 11 particularly. So when you're, talking about, and there has definitely been a trend in rural residential development, that brings with it a whole host of costs related to public services. So you're talking about long bus routes. You're talking about increased costs for fire protection, for police protection, for road maintenance, and all of that brings when you're pushing out into rural areas. And that needs to be, weighed against increasing development or densification of development within those areas of Neskowin that are suitable for that type of development, or relocating to other urbanized areas that have the services that are available and don't have the degree of costs and also risks that developing in rural areas have. And then, of course, the last aspect of rural residential development is that that it can create conditions for conflicts between those residential uses and commercial forest or commercial agricultural uses. So whether it's conflicts around pesticides, herbicide applications, or other very common agricultural and forestry practices, the potential for those conflicts exists, and it can have a detrimental effect on the fabric of the community, both the residential community out there and particularly on agricultural communities where that happens. And so, in these instances, for those reasons, they really encourage communities to look at allowing density, increasing density in those areas that are appropriate from a hazards perspective for development. And, I certainly recognize that nobody wants to be displaced, from the area where they live, where, they have friends and relationships, but realize that also when you relocate to, say, an agricultural community, that intensification of residential development can have that exact effect on agricultural communities, right? Because of those conflicts, it can erode the fabric of existing agricultural communities and cause displacement. So it's a tough question. It's a hard thing to grapple with. And as far as interactions with other coastal communities, our hazards team and coastal team have done a lot of that work and hazard mitigation planning, and have been privy to a lot of those conversations and have maybe a slightly different perspective than I do, talking about it from the goal 3 and 4 perspective.
Thank you, Hilary. Appreciate that. I don't see any questions in the chat. Chris, Randall, Brenda, anybody have anything you'd like to ask Hilary or Jim?
Sure, I don't have any questions that haven't already been answered by Hilary and Jim.
Okay, well, we are actually at the top of the hour. Randall, I saw you unmuted yourself. Please go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure. It's when I was understanding what Hilary was saying, I was thinking of a specific place across the highway that has the potential, it seems, to be a village, but the zoning is not appropriate for it currently. But I think I would just ponder the various conditions she said would be required, and efficiencies, et cetera, before I would ask that question about a specific piece of land. So I'll leave it with my, having been educated a bit there by Hilary's observations, and leave it at that, with trying to pursue that on my own time and not on the committee's time. So thank you.
Thank you, Randall. Okay, well, Hilary and Jim, thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you both. Thank you for all you do, and thank you for enlightening us all on, you know, giving us a refreshed and a new perspective on resource lands. So Brenda, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, Hilary and Jim.
No, it's a pleasure to be here this evening, and it's kind of fun to talk about Tillamook for a change, and it's so good to see everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and thank you for the survey questions. We will take note of that, because Sarah's right. You know, that's my main involvement here and interest, is actually collecting those survey questions. So we will ask something like that. I'd like to follow up with you when we get closer to getting to the survey, running the questions by you, because you guys had great questions. So, but that's still like 6 months away or so. But thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Oh, I do want to do, I think this is the last informational town hall we're going to have for this year. Is that right, Rand and Chris?
That's correct.
I'm going to make a plug for those of you here, tell your friends and neighbors that we anticipate that the next one will be in February, and it's going to be about the watershed acquisition and the conversations that we could have about that. So there's already underway. There's lots of things happening. So and there's also going to be, I think we should, should we, Rand and Chris, do we remember the two other ones? There's going to be, well, I do want to say.
One of them was on incorporation, and the other one was on energy. Yeah.
So think about that, you know, the benefits and drawbacks of incorporating. We're going to have a conversation. And, you know, renewable energy and energy sources, and do we as a community want to support that somehow in our plan? There might be other topics. And since Hilary mentioned something about the fire, there's going to be a new fire map and all that that's coming out. I think we should add that as like a fourth topic. Like if that's coming out, you know, it sounds like you guys are going to be doing your road show around the time when we'll be picking up again. So maybe we can have them back in March or April or something, because I think that would be good to hear, to see what that revised plan was and what does that mean for Nesquin, because I'm usually very optimistic. I just have to say this. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when that fire comes through here.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of when. So how prepared are we going to be? Okay, so Rand, close it out.
Well, just thank you all for coming, and we'll see you in February, or we'll see you later in the spring, Jim and Hilary. All right.
Right.
Thank
Thanks,
you all.
everyone.
Thank
Good
you.
evening.
Inviting me.
Bye, everybody.
You bet.
Right.